The far-right extremist group, the Proud Boys, who played a key role in the January 6th insurrection, have been regrouping ahead of tomorrow's election and, among other things, have begun amplifying conspiracy theories on platforms like Telegram and Truth Social that a Trump loss could only be due to ballot fraud. They are just one of a number of groups already spreading disinformation on more right-wing fringe platforms. But the same disinformation is also showing up on the X site formerly known as Twitter, which is, of course, under the control of South African former undocumented immigrant turned immigrant hater Elon Musk, one of the biggest pushers of disinformation on the planet, and someone who reportedly speaks regularly with Vladimir Putin. Musk is, of course, helping to bankroll Trump's campaign and running part of the ground operation, one might say, into the ground. A group of mostly black canvassers who were tricked into canvassing in Michigan, seatbelt free in the back of a cargo van, were fired after speaking out to a Wired reporter. Seems you can take the boy out of apartheid, but not the apartheid out of the boy. Elon Musk has a huge financial stake in the outcome of this election. He has billions of dollars in current defense contracts and would love to control a president who could cut his taxes and deregulate his businesses while putting him in charge of government functions, all while he remains the owner of one of the biggest social media platforms, where he can allow right-wing disinformation to run rampant to try to help his candidate win. Joining me now is MSNBC political analyst David Jolly, who served in Congress as a Republican but is no longer affiliated with the party. I think the biggest question that I have when I look at Elon Musk and the various ways he's involved in the campaign is, how is it legal? You were in Congress. How is it legal?
Yeah, well, you saw some of it play out in court today.
In Philly, yeah.
His $1 million gifts. And honestly, it was a fairly strategic argument they made that actually this isn't a lottery. We pre-selected brand ambassadors and therefore gave them $1 million. And I think that's part of what's unsettling about Elon Musk's involvement is he is more sophisticated and sober and thoughtful, I know that sounds crazy, than Donald Trump. Donald Trump is pure chaos.
Isn't everyone?
I know. But in terms of election meddling, disinformation, and so forth, you have an actor in Elon Musk who actually lawyers up with real lawyers for achieving the end means, or the end that he wants to achieve. And then you bring in the fact that as you mentioned, the Wall Street Journal has reported his frequent conversations with Vladimir Putin. His own social media following is at 200 million people that he can reach with disinformation. And we know where his treasure is, so is his heart. He wants Donald Trump to win this race, and he's going to influence it by any means necessary, legal or otherwise.
And, I mean, I have a headline here from NBC. Elon Musk's misleading election claims this year have reached 1.2 billion with a B people on X Twitter because he controls the algorithm. And so we've never had a situation where you have somebody controlling the algorithm of what everyone is taking in. He can suppress Democratic posts and suppress Democratic content, boost Trump content, and he's essentially sort of mind melding with billions of people to try to get Trump elected for his own enrichment.
That's right.
And so at some point, doesn't Congress need to think about some sort of regulation to not allow somebody like that to play on both sides of a political election?
Yeah, a big question about the regulation of social media platforms. Is it a provider for free speech communities, or is it a producer of content? And Elon Musk raises the interesting question because he controls it and he's producing the disinformation. And so you have 500 million users roughly of X, or formerly Twitter. You have 200 million daily users. Here's the most worrisome part for me, Joy, is this. We know the influence disinformation can have on the election itself. We know Russia, China, Iran, all the foreign actors want to cause chaos and disinformation. It's verifiable that Elon Musk is amplifying that disinformation going into tomorrow night. The most worrisome part is the day after the election. Or tomorrow night when Donald Trump declares victory.
Which he will.
And now to have an ally with Elon Musk who amplifies the false conspiracies of a Donald Trump victory, or helps Donald Trump contest this in states. We're repeating 4 years ago what led to January 6th, fueled by disinformation and lies. And we expect it from Donald Trump, but I think we're late to the game to realize Elon Musk might be an even greater purveyor going into this January 6th than Donald Trump.
And we can't count on the Republican Party writ large to say anything about it, right? So if he comes out and says he won, Marco Rubio will say he won, and Tim Scott will say he won. They're all going to repeat it. And then where are we as a country heading into another January 6th? Thank goodness it's Joe Biden in charge of the National Guard, and he will protect the Capitol. But where do we stand if the Republican Party, even if Trump loses definitively, still doesn't have the guts. And corporate America, we're now hearing, will not come forward and try to say this is unacceptable.
That morning after scenario, again, not to be a Debbie Downer, we're like 48 hours from this.
Yeah.
And one of the first ways Donald Trump will try to say the election was stolen is there will very likely be an undervote in most states between the number of people who vote for Donald Trump and the next down ballot statewide Republican.
Right.
And that's how Republicans say, oh, votes are stolen from Trump. They don't realize people just don't like Donald Trump.
They don't like him.
That's why they're doing it. And so it leads us to a place where the certification of the election once again is in question. And I think what Donald Trump is ultimately playing to is that he doesn't care who declares the election this cycle. He doesn't care if MSNBC or AP or
doesn't matter.
Anybody else declares it. This is a race all the way to January.
That's right.
For Donald Trump. And a lot of people, even Republicans, even MAGA Republicans might say Donald Trump loses and he goes away. He doesn't go away. He might go to prison, but I promise you, he will consider running in 2028.
Yeah.
And if he is not the king in 28, he'll be the kingmaker.
Yeah.
He will have an apprentice Republican primary down at Mar-a-Lago to control the 28 process. He's not going anywhere.
He doesn't want to go anywhere. Last question. Could you ever imagine that a presidential candidate would do what he did with that microphone in front of children, in front of families with kids?
There's a deep cultural rot in the country, and it's reflected in our politics. And I credit Stuart Stevens many years ago when he said, Donald Trump didn't change us, he revealed us.
Yeah.
Donald Trump has revealed who we are in this country.
Yeah.
It reflects a deep culture.
Between that and the people laughing when he talked about shooting the press, the people behind him laughing, it's pretty disgusting and vulgar. We need to do better as a country. David Jolly, we'll see what happens tomorrow. Thank you very much, my friend.